The red dust hung in the air like smoke. Christopher Hedge cut the engine and stepped out into the kind of silence that only exists in the Australian outback. The silence before something breaks. He was 51 years old, weathered by a decade of documenting wildlife across these ancient plains, and he'd learned to trust his instincts. Something was wrong here. The abandoned cattle station had been empty for 3 years, ever since the drought forced the McKinnon family off their land. Now it was just rusted fencing, collapsed sheds, and the skeletal remains of windmills that no longer turned. But today, something moved in the shadows near the old water tank. Christopher raised his camera, more from habit than intention, and zoomed in. What he saw made his breath catch. A massive red kangaroo buck, easily 2 meters tall, was tangled in barbed wire fencing that had wrapped around his body like a death shroud. The wire cut deep into gray for matted with dried blood. The roo's powerful hind legs, built to cover 8 meters in a single bound, were nearly useless now, hobbled by the cruel metal coils. But it wasn't the wire that stopped Christopher cold. It was the roo's eyes. Even from this distance through the camera lens, Christopher could see the intelligence there and the resignation. This wasn't just any kangaroo. Big males like this were leaders, defenders of their mob. This one had scars across his chest and shoulders that told stories of battles won, of younger males challenged and defeated, of a mob protected through droughts and dingo attacks. Now he stood alone, waiting to die. Christopher scanned the perimeter. Wedge-tailed eagles circled overhead, their 3-meter wingspans casting shadows across the cracked earth. They were patient. They knew. He grabbed his emergency kit and started walking. The heat pressed down like a hand. It was 42 degrees Celsius, and the shimmer rising from the ground made everything waver like a mirage. Spine-effects grass crunched under Christopher's boots. Each step kicked up red dust that stuck to the sweat on his arms. 50 meters out, the kangaroo's head lifted slightly. Those dark eyes tracked Christopher's approach. The roo's chest heaved with shallow breaths. How long had he been trapped? Days? Weeks? 30 meters. Christopher could see now that the wire had cut so deep in places that it had embedded into the flesh. Infection had set in. Dark streaks radiated from the wounds. The roo's normally powerful frame was gaunt, ribs visible through the fur. Dehydration had sunken his eyes. 20 meters. The kangaroo tried to move, tried to hop backward, but the wire pulled tight and he stumbled. A sound escaped him, not quite a grunt, more like a wheeze of defeat. He steadied himself, breathing hard, and went still again. 10 meters. Christopher knelt slowly, setting down his pack. He pulled out wire cutters, antiseptic, bandages. But as he looked at the complexity of the wire entanglement, at how deep it had cut, at how weak the roo was, a cold realization settled over him. This wasn't a simple rescue. This was survival surgery in 42-degree heat with no anesthetic, no veterinary support, and a 200-pound wild animal who might have just enough strength left to kill him with one kick. And he had maybe an hour before this roo's body gave out completely. Christopher looked into those intelligent eyes again. "I'm going to try, mate," he said quietly, "but I need you to trust me." The kangaroo's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. Then, from somewhere beyond the collapsed sheds, Christopher heard something else. A soft thump, 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 the rhythmic sound of another kangaroo approaching. Christopher's head snapped up. Through the heat shimmer, another shape emerged from the scrubland. Another large male, moving with purpose despite a pronounced limp. This one was smaller than the trapped roo, but still massive, with distinctive scars across his face and a notch missing from his left ear. The newcomer stopped 30 meters away, watching. Christopher's mind raced. 2 big males. Territorial rivals? Brothers? He'd seen mobs led by related males before, but this was different. The approaching roo showed no aggression, no territorial display, just that steady, watchful gaze. The trapped kangaroo made a sound, a soft clicking in his throat. The other roo clicked back. And then Christopher understood something that made his chest tighten. They knew each other. But before he could process what that meant, a new sound cut through the silence. A sound that turned his blood cold. The rumble of an engine. Multiple engines. Christopher turned and saw dust rising from the access road, still kilometers away, but closing fast. He recognized the vehicles immediately. Cattle station hands in a four-wheel drive convoy, probably coming to salvage scrap metal from the abandoned property. They'd see the kangaroos. They'd see him trying to help. And out here, where drought had hardened hearts and wallets, where some folks still saw roos as nothing more than pests eating grass meant for cattle, even cattle that no longer existed, he knew exactly what would happen next. They wouldn't wait for rescue. They wouldn't call for help. They'd put both roosts down and be done with it. Christopher had maybe 10 minutes before they arrived. The trapped kangaroo was dying. The second roost stood watching. And Christopher Hedge had to make a choice that would either save a life or end his own. He looked at the wire cutters in his hand, then at the approaching dust cloud, then back into those trusting, desperate eyes. Right then, he whispered, "Let's do this fast." He moved toward the trapped roo, reaching for the first wire. The kangaroo didn't move, but the sound of engines grew louder. And somewhere in the spine effects, something else was watching, something with teeth and patience and hunger. The wedge-tailed eagles circled lower. Time was up. If you believe every life deserves a fighting chance, if stories of survival, sacrifice, and loyalty matter to you, tap that like button, hit subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to see what happens next. Because what Christopher discovers in the next few minutes will change everything he thought he knew about brotherhood, survival, and the bonds that endure even in the harshest places on Earth. 18 months earlier, the plains had been different. Water still ran in the creeks, and the mulga scrubland bloomed with yellow flowers that attracted insects, which attracted birds, which attracted life. The mob grazed peacefully across their territory. 15 does, 11 joeys, and 2 dominant males. The older male was called Mataranka by the local Aboriginal rangers who tracked the mob's movements. He was massive, nearly 2 meters tall when upright, with russet red fur that seemed to glow in the late afternoon sun. His chest was broad and scarred from years of defending the mob. Every joey in the group carried his genetics. He was protector, leader, and the reason the mob had survived 3 droughts and 2 dingo pack migrations. The younger male, his half-brother, bore scars too, but his were different. A notch in his left ear from a barbed wire fence. Claw marks across his shoulders from a dingo he'd fought off when barely adult. The rangers called him Boomer, and he moved with a distinctive rolling gait from an old injury to his left hip. Boomer respected his brother absolutely. They'd been born to the same mother 2 breeding seasons apart. When Mataranka had defeated the previous dominant male and taken control of the mob, Boomer could have challenged him. Young males often did, driven by instinct and testosterone to establish dominance. But Boomer never challenged. He defended his brother's rule, helped drive off rivals, and stood watch while Mataranka rested. They were a partnership, and the mob thrived because of it. On this particular evening, Mataranka was teaching his youngest joey, a 6-month-old male called Skip by the rangers, how to identify safe feeding grounds. The joey bounded ahead enthusiastically, his small body still clumsy with youth. Stay close. The does signal with soft clucking sounds. But Skip had spotted something fascinating. A blue-tongued lizard sunning itself on a rock near the old cattle station. The joey hopped closer, curiosity overriding caution. The lizard darted away, disappearing into a pile of rusted farm equipment. Skip followed. Mataranka's head snapped up. Something felt wrong. The collapsed shed, the rusted machinery, the scattered debris. This wasn't safe ground for a curious joey. He bounded forward, powerful legs covering the distance in 3 massive leaps. Skip had his nose in a tangle of old fencing wire. Tried to reach the lizard underneath. The wires shifted, and suddenly the entire pile began to collapse. Mataranka crashed into his son, shoving him clear just as 20 meters of rusted barbed wire fencing tumbled from where it had been stacked against the shed wall. The joey rolled clear, squealing in surprise but unhurt. Mataranka wasn't as lucky. The wire fell across his back, tangled around his powerful hind legs, and when he tried to hop clear, it pulled tight. Barbs bit into flesh. He jerked instinctively, and the wire coiled tighter, like a snake constricting its prey. He fell. The Joey's frightened cries brought the mob running. Boomer arrived first, assessing the situation with sharp eyes. He grabbed the wire in his clawed hands and tried to pull it free, but the barbs had dug deep. Every movement made it worse. The does circled, clicking anxiously. Skip huddled against his mother, shaking. For 20 minutes, Boomer worked at the wire, but his paws weren't built for this kind of delicate task. The wire was old, brittle, and covered in rust. When he pulled too hard, it broke, leaving even more loose and to tangle and cut. Finally, exhausted and bleeding from his own paws, Boomer stepped back. Mataranka lay on his side, breathing hard, wire wrapped around his legs and lower back. He couldn't stand. He couldn't hop. He could barely move. The Joey approached cautiously, sniffing at his father. Mataranka nuzzled him gently, then made a low sound that meant, "Not your fault." But in the Joey's eyes, there was guilt anyway. That night, the mob stayed close. They grazed nearby, never straying far. Boomer stood watch through the darkness, scanning for dingoes, while Mataranka lay tangled and helpless. When dawn broke, Mataranka managed to drag himself upright using his powerful arms and tail. The wire had cut deep grooves into his flesh, but he could move, barely. Each hop was agony. Each movement pulled the barbs deeper, but he could move. For 3 weeks, the mob adjusted their patterns. They grazed closer to water sources. They avoided long migrations. They moved slowly, always at Mataranka's pace. And then the drought came. It started with the creek, drying up, then the water holes began to shrink. The grass turned brown, then gray, then disappeared into dust. The temperature climbed and stayed there, baking the earth until it cracked. Food became scarce. Water became scarcer. The mob grew thin. One evening, as the sun set blood-red through the dust, Boomer stood on a small rise, surveying their territory. Behind him, the mob waited. Ahead, he could see where the drought hadn't hit as hard yet. Greener land in the north, where the rangers said a creek still ran, 20 kilometers away. For a healthy mob, that was 2 days' travel. For a mob moving at Mataranka's crippled pace, it might as well be 200. Boomer looked back at his brother. Mataranka met his gaze and understood immediately what Boomer was thinking. The mob needed to move north. Survival depended on it. But Mataranka couldn't move fast enough to keep up. That night, Boomer called the mob together with a series of sharp thumps, his powerful hind legs drumming the earth in the old signal for important decisions. The does gathered close, Joeys tucked against their sides. Boomer made his case with sounds and movements the mob understood. North, water, survival. The mob looked to Mataranka. The old dominant male was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. They would go north at dawn. All night, Skip stayed pressed against his father's side. Mataranka groomed the Joey's fur, making soft, clicking sounds of comfort. But both of them knew what morning would bring. When the first light touched the horizon, Boomer assembled the mob. The does formed a line, Joey's between them. Boomer took the lead position, the dominant male's position. Mataranka struggled to his feet. The mob began to move. Every few meters, they stopped and waited for Mataranka to catch up. Each hop clearly caused him pain. The wire had infected the wounds now. Christopher would have seen the dark streaks if he'd been there. Fever had set in. By midday, they'd covered less than a kilometer. The Joeys were crying from thirst. The does were growing desperate. And Boomer was facing the hardest decision of his life. 3 days into the migration, everything fell apart. The mob had barely covered 5 kilometers. Mataranka was struggling now, each movement weaker than the last. Infection had spread through his system. He stumbled more than he hopped, and twice he collapsed completely, unable to rise until he'd rested for an hour. The drought had accelerated. A hot north wind, what the old-timers called a brick fielder, blew in, raising the temperature to 45 degrees. Two of the youngest Joeys were showing signs of heat exhaustion. Boomer stood on a rocky outcrop, scanning the horizon. Behind him, the mob huddled in what little shade the spine effects provided. Ahead, the land stretched empty and brown. The green country they needed was still 15 kilometers away. 15 kilometers they couldn't cover. One of the does, the Joey Skip's mother, approached Boomer and made a soft sound. Her message was clear. We're dying here. We have to move faster. Boomer looked back at Mataranka. His brother lay on his side, barely conscious, the wire now crusted with dried blood and pus. For the first time in his life, Boomer felt something he'd never experienced before, resentment. Not at his brother, never at his brother, but at the situation, at the drought, at the cruel mathematics of survival that said one life might have to be sacrificed to save 15 others. That night, Boomer didn't sleep. He kept watch as always, but his mind churned with calculations he didn't want to make. The doves were growing restless. If he didn't lead them north soon, some would break off and try to make it on their own, splitting the mob. Mob survival depended on unity. Divided, they'd be picked off by dingoes. Just before dawn, Mataranka opened his eyes. The two brothers looked at each other across the camp. In that moment, something passed between them, an understanding that needed no sounds, no gestures. Mataranka knew. When the sun rose, Mataranka did something that would haunt Boomer for the rest of his life. He stood, using every last bit of strength he had, and he began to hop, not north with the mob, but south, back toward the abandoned cattle station, back toward the place where the wire had first trapped him, away from his family. Skip cried out and tried to follow, but his mother held him back. The doves watched in silence. Boomer stood frozen, understanding what his brother was doing but unable to accept it. Mataranka didn't look back. He just kept moving, one agonizing hop at a time, growing smaller in the distance. He was making the choice, so Boomer didn't have to. When Mataranka finally disappeared behind a low rise, Skip's cries reached a desperate pitch. His mother tried to comfort him, but the Joey kept struggling, kept trying to follow his father. Boomer's heart shattered, but he was the leader now. The mob's survival was his responsibility. He thumped the ground once, sharply, and turned north. The mob followed, all except Skip, who sat staring at the place where his father had vanished, making small, lost sounds that cut through morning air like knives. For Mataranka, the days that followed were a descent into a kind of hell the Outback reserves for the desperate. He made it back to the abandoned cattle station on the third day, collapsing in the shade of the old water tank. The wire had worked deeper into his flesh with every movement. He could no longer use his right hind leg at all. His left was barely functional. Hunting was impossible. Kangaroos couldn't hunt anyway. They were grazers, but finding food required movement, and movement was agony. He survived on whatever he could reach from where he lay. Dry grass, dead insects. Once, he managed to drag himself to a patch of saltbush and ate until his stomach cramped. But the plant had no real nutrition, just enough to keep his gut from shutting down completely. Water was the real problem. The old tank still had a few centimeters of water in the bottom, turned green and foul with algae. Mataranka had to lean dangerously over the edge to reach it, and each time he did, he risked falling in and drowning. But thirst drove him to it, again and again. The dingoes came on the fifth night. There were 4 of them, lean, rangy, and desperate from the same drought that had driven the kangaroos north. They circled the water tank, testing, watching. Mataranka dragged himself upright and faced them. Even wounded, even dying, a full-grown male red kangaroo was dangerous. His arms still had strength. His claws could disembowel a dingo with one strike. The pack leader, a gray female with intelligent eyes, seemed to calculate the risk. She circled closer, and Mataranka lunged, not at her, but at the space between them, demonstrating that he could still move, still fight. The dingoes backed off, but they didn't leave. They took up positions 30 meters away and settled down to wait. They were patient. They knew what Mataranka knew. It was only a matter of time. Each day, Mataranka grew weaker. Each day, the dingoes crept closer. By the second week, they were circling just 10 meters away. Mataranka could barely lift his head anymore. The fever had taken hold completely. His vision blurred. Sometimes he thought he saw his brother in the distance, or heard Skip's voice calling to him. But it was always just the wind or the heat shimmer or his dying mind playing tricks. The eagles had found him by then. Wedge-tailed eagles with wingspans that blocked out the sun. They perched on the old shed roof, watching, waiting for him to stop moving. Everything was waiting. On the 15th day, Mataranka accepted that this was where he would die. Alone, trapped by a wire he couldn't escape. In a place of rust and dust and abandonment, he closed his eyes and let the darkness come. But somewhere deep in his fading consciousness, he heard something that shouldn't be there. The sound of an engine, the sound of tires on gravel, the sound of a door opening and footsteps approaching, and a human voice, rough with emotion, saying, "Christ, what happened to you, mate?" Mataranka's eyes opened to slits. Through the haze of fever, he saw a shape kneeling beside him. A man, older, weathered face, gray in his beard, eyes that had seen enough of the Outback to understand what he was looking at. Christopher Hedge, the photographer who'd spent 10 years documenting these plains, who'd seen mobs rise and fall, who'd tracked Mataranka's mob since he first arrived, giving them names, learning their patterns, respecting their territory. Christopher's hands were gentle as they touched the wire, assessing the damage. His voice was steady as he spoke into a satellite phone, calling for help. And for the first time in 15 days, Mataranka felt something other than pain and resignation. He felt hope. But then Christopher's head snapped up, looking at something in the distance. His expression changed, became urgent, frightened. Mataranka couldn't see what Christopher saw, but he could hear it. Engines, multiple engines, getting closer. And the fear in Christopher's eyes told him everything he needed to know about what was coming. Christopher's mind raced as he stared at the approaching dust cloud. He knew that convoy. 3 vehicles, 2 pickup trucks, and a heavy-duty 4WD. That would be the Reynolds crew, scrap metal salvagers who'd been systematically stripping abandoned properties across the region. They weren't bad men, exactly, just hard men, made harder by the drought, operating in the gray areas of the law. Technically, this property still belonged to the bank. Technically, they were trespassing. But nobody cared about technicalities out here. What Christopher knew, what made his stomach knot, was that the Reynolds brothers had a reputation. They shot roos on sight, claiming they were pests, claiming the meat fed their dogs. Sometimes that was even true, but mostly they just didn't care. And a big male wrapped in wire, barely alive, would be seen as nothing more than a mercy killing. Christopher looked at his satellite phone. The rescue team was an hour away, minimum. He called Sarah at the Outback Wildlife Rescue just 5 minutes ago, and she promised come. But she was based in Alice Springs, and the roads out here were rough even in dry season. An hour. The Reynolds crew would be here in 5 minutes. Mataranka watched him with those dark, intelligent eyes. Somehow, the Roo seemed to understand the urgency. Christopher made a decision. He ran to his Land Cruiser and yanked open the back. His photography equipment, Expensive cameras, lenses worth thousands, he shoved aside without care. What he needed was an emergency kit he kept for remote shoots. A small portable generator, 50 meters of lightweight electrical wire, a car battery, tent stakes, and wire cutters. He'd used this setup before to keep dingoes away from campsites, creating temporary electric fences that delivered enough shock to deter without seriously harming. It was crude, but it worked. If he could create a perimeter around Mataranka, he could keep the Reynolds crew from getting close. Maybe, if they respected boundaries. If they didn't just cut through. It was a terrible plan. It was the only plan he had. Christopher worked frantically, driving stakes in a circle around the roo, stringing wire between them at chest height. His hands shook as he connected the battery terminals. When the circuit closed, a faint hum filled the air. The dust cloud was closer now. He could make out individual vehicles. Christopher grabbed a water bottle and knelt beside Mataranka. "I need you to trust me, mate. Stay inside the circle, yeah? Don't touch the wire." The roo's ears twitched. Christopher stood and walked out to meet the convoy, positioning himself between them and Mataranka. The vehicles pulled up in a spray of dust. 3 men climbed out, all wearing the same expression of mild annoyance at finding someone else on what they considered their salvage territory. The eldest Reynolds brother, Jack, a man in his 60s with a face like tan leather, took the lead. "Bit off your usual route, aren't you, Hedge?" Christopher kept his voice level. "Could say the same. This property's still bank-owned, and we got permission to salvage." Jack pulled a folded paper from his pocket. Probably legitimate. Probably not worth the ink it was printed on. "So unless you're planning to buy this place, there's an injured roo. Rescue's on the way." Jack's expression didn't change. "Injured, wrapped in barbed wire. Been there a while." One of the younger men, Jack's nephew, Billy, laughed. "Then he's past saving. We'll put him down quick." "No." Christopher didn't move. "Rescue's coming." "An hour?" Jack studied him for a long moment. "You put up an electric fence for a roo?" "I did." "That's the dumbest thing I've ever seen." But there was something in Jack's voice that wasn't quite mockery. Maybe respect. Maybe just curiosity at Christopher's commitment to stupidity. Billy didn't share his uncle's restraint. He walked toward the perimeter, pulling a rifle from the truck as he went. "This is a waste of time. I'll handle it." "Billy." Jack's voice had steel in it. "Hold up." But Billy was young and sure of himself. He approached the wire fence, studying it with a smirk. "You really think this'll stop?" The dingoes chose that moment to make their move. They'd been watching from the scrubland, waiting for Mataranka to die, and the sudden arrival of vehicles and people had made them nervous. The pack leader decided that if she was going to get her kill, it had to be now. For dingoes burst from the Spinifex, heading straight for the electric perimeter. Billy jumped back, raising his rifle. Christopher shouted, "Don't shoot! They'll veer off." But the lead dingo didn't veer. She was committed. She leaped, clearing the wire by centimeters, and landed inside the perimeter with Mataranka. The wounded roo tried to rise, tried to defend himself, but his legs wouldn't support him. The dingo circled, looking for the killing bite. Christopher vaulted the fence without thinking, putting himself between predator and prey. He had nothing. No weapon, no real plan, just his body and his voice as he shouted and waved his arms. The dingo hesitated. She was hungry, not suicidal. This human was acting crazy enough to be dangerous. Behind him, Christopher heard Billy rack the rifle. "Don't!" Jack barked. "You'll hit Hedge." The dingo's eyes flicked between Christopher, Mataranka, and the men outside the perimeter. She was calculating odds, and they were shifting against her. Then something happened that Christopher will remember for the rest of his life. From beyond the collapsed sheds, a new figure appeared. Another massive red kangaroo, moving with distinctive rolling gait, scars across his face, and a notch missing from his left ear. Boomer. He'd come back. Boomer's return changed everything. He'd been gone for 12 days. 12 days of leading the mob north, finding water, finding food, re-establishing territory. The mob had survived. They were recovering. But every night, Boomer had stared south, thinking about his brother alone at the cattle station. And finally, he couldn't stand it anymore. He'd left the mob in the care of the lead doe and made the journey back. 20 kilometers across drought-ravaged country, moving at full speed, driven by something stronger than instinct or territory or survival, driven by loyalty. Now he bounded into the chaos at full speed, and the dingoes scattered. Even hungry and desperate, they knew better than to face a healthy adult male in his prime. Boomer skidded to a stop at the electric fence, assessing the situation with sharp eyes. His brother, barely alive. A human standing over him protectively. Other humans with guns. Dingoes regrouping in the distance. The logical thing would be to run. But Boomer had never been good at logic. When it came to his brother, he circled the perimeter, studying the wire setup. His nostrils flared, catching the scent of electricity. He'd encountered electric cattle fences before, had the scars to prove it, and he respected them. But he also understood something the humans hadn't counted on. Kangaroos could dig. He began scraping at the base of one of the stakes with his powerful hind claws. Jesus, Billy muttered. He's trying to get in. Jack watched with fascination. Never seen a roo do that before. Christopher realized what was happening. Boomer wasn't attacking. He was trying to reach Mataranka. The connection between these two animals was deeper than he'd understood. Brothers, he said softly. They're brothers. The stake began to wobble. Boomer's digging had loosened it significantly. One more good pull, and it would come free. Back up. Christopher called to the Reynolds crew. Give him space. Billy looked like he wanted to argue, but Jack nodded. They moved their vehicles back 20 meters. Boomer grabbed the stake in his powerful arms and yanked. It came free with a spray of dirt. The wire drooped, no longer taut, no longer carrying current. The younger Roo carefully stepped over the wire and approached his brother. Mataranka's eyes opened. The two Roos touched noses, a gentle gesture of recognition and affection. Then Boomer began examining the wire tangled in his brother's body, using his claws to carefully probe where it was embedded. He wasn't trying to remove it. He seemed to understand that was beyond his ability, but he was checking the damage, assessing what could be done. Christopher watched in awe. This was intelligence. This was problem-solving. This was love. I'll be damned, Jack said quietly. He'd lowered his rifle. Billy, put that gun away. But I said put away. Jack's voice had that note of finality that ended arguments. We're not shooting either of these animals. Billy reluctantly complied. The dingoes, seeing two healthy males now, slunk away into the scrub. They'd find easier prey elsewhere. Christopher approached slowly, keeping his movements calm and predictable. Hey, Boomer, he said softly, using the name the Rangers had given this Roo. I'm trying to help. Sarah's coming with real tools, real medicine, but I need you to let me work. Boomer's ears swiveled toward Christopher's voice. The Roo watched him warily, but didn't move away. Christopher knelt and began examining the wire more closely. It was worse than he'd thought. In the 2 weeks since Mataranka had dragged himself back here, the wire had actually fused with infected tissue in several places. Removing it would require surgical precision. He started with the easiest sections, wire that was merely tangled, not embedded. Each time he cut a strand, Mataranka flinched, but Boomer made a soft sound, and somehow that seemed to calm his brother. Jack Reynolds came closer, studying the situation. That wire's been there a long time. Weeks, maybe longer. Infection's bad. I know. Even if you get it off. Jack trailed off. They both knew what he meant. The damage might be too severe. But Christopher kept working. He was halfway through when he heard the most beautiful sound in the world. The whump, whump, whump of helicopter rotors. Sarah hadn't driven. She'd commandeered the rescue helicopter. The aircraft came in low, landing in a clear patch 50 meters away. Dr. Sarah Chun jumped out before the skids fully touched Earth, her medical bag in one hand, a tranquilizer rifle in the other. She was Chinese-Australian, 45 years old, and the best wildlife vet in the Northern Territory. Christopher had worked with her a dozen times over the years. She took one look at the scene. 2 massive roofs, wire everywhere, Christopher kneeling between them, and the Reynolds crew standing guard, and her professional mask slipped for just a second. Christopher, what in the hell have you gotten yourself into? Long story. Can we save him? Sarah knelt beside Mataranka, her hands already assessing wounds, checking vital signs. Her expression grew grim. Maybe, but we need to move fast. That infection's gone septic. Another day and there'd be nothing to save. She looked at Boomer, who hadn't moved from his protective position beside his brother. And him. He came back for his brother. Crossed 20 kilometers to get here. Sarah's eyes softened. Then he's earned the right to watch. She prepared a sedative dart, carefully calculated for Mataranka's weight and condition. Too much would kill him. Too little would leave him in agony during the wire removal. This is going to hurt him, she warned, and his brother might not understand we're helping. I'll handle Boomer, Christopher said, though he had no idea how. Sarah raised the tranquilizer rifle. Boomer's eyes tracked the movement, and tension coiled through his powerful body. Christopher stepped between them, hands raised in a calming gesture. It's okay, mate. We're trying to save him. Boomer's ears flattened. He understood guns. Guns meant death. Sarah fired. The dart hit Mataranka in the shoulder with a soft thump. The wounded Roo jerked, and Boomer exploded into motion. He lunged at Sarah, claws extended, every instinct screaming to defend his brother from this attack. Christopher threw himself forward, catching Boomer mid-lunge. 200 pounds of kangaroo muscle slammed into him, and they went down together in a tangle of limbs and dust. Boomer could have killed him easily. One kick from those powerful legs would have caved in Christopher's ribs. But something held the Roo back. Maybe the fact that Christopher had protected his brother from the dingo. Maybe the tone of Christopher's voice. Maybe just confusion at this human who kept putting himself in harm's way. They stared at each other from inches away, both breathing hard. Please, Christopher whispered. Let us help. For 3 long heartbeats. It could have gone either way. Then Mataranka made a sound, soft, already slurred from the sedative taking effect. Boomer's head whipped around toward his brother. Mataranka was still conscious, but fading, and his eyes were calm, not afraid, trusting. Slowly, Boomer stepped back off Christopher. Sarah and her assistant moved in immediately, setting up a portable surgical station. They had 20 minutes, maybe 30, before the sedative wore off. The wire removal was brutal even to watch. Sarah worked with incredible precision, cutting where she could, carefully working embedded barbs free from infected flesh. Each section she removed was coated in blood and pus. The assistant cleaned wounds, applied antibiotics, prepared sutures. Christopher held his camera, but couldn't bring himself to film. Some moments felt too private, too raw. Boomer stood at the edge of the surgical area, watching everything. His eyes never left his brother. Jack Reynolds and his crew had pulled their trucks into a defensive perimeter, creating shade and blocking the wind. Billy, who'd wanted to shoot both Roos an hour ago, was now helping Sarah's assistant hold 4 bags. 35 minutes later, Sarah cut the last piece of wire free. It was 18 meters long when they laid it out. 18 meters of barbed wire that had wrapped and rewrapped around Mataranka's body, cutting deeper with every movement, slowly killing him over weeks. The wounds looked terrible, raw, infected, some deep enough to show bone. But they were clean now, disinfected. Suture were necessary. Sarah administered antibiotics, fluids, and a carefully calculated dose of pain medication. Then they waited for Mataranka to wake up. Mataranka's eyes opened slowly. The first thing he saw was Boomer's face, close and worried. The second thing he felt was the absence of pain, not gone entirely, but dulled to something manageable. The third thing he registered was that he could move his legs. Not well, not without discomfort, but he could move them. Sarah watched from a safe distance as Mataranka struggled to his feet. He wobbled, nearly fell, caught himself with his tail. His muscles had atrophied from weeks of immobility. Infection had sapped his strength, but he was standing. Boomer moved to his brother's side, providing support, letting Mataranka lean against him. "We need to get him to the sanctuary," Sarah said. "He needs weeks of care, monitoring for sepsis, physical therapy." Christopher nodded. "How do we transport him?" Carefully. Sarah was already signaling the helicopter pilot. "We've got a recovery cage, but loading him will be tricky." Jack Reynolds stepped forward. "We've got livestock crates in the trucks. Might work better than trying to get him into a helicopter." Sarah considered. "Your trucks can handle the terrain?" "We haul cattle across this country. We can handle one roo." It took an hour to rig up a suitable transport. They lined a heavy-duty crate with blankets, cut ventilation holes, and secured it in the bed of Jack's largest truck. The hard part was getting Mataranka inside. He didn't want to go into the enclosed space. Every instinct said, trapped equals death, but Boomer did something extraordinary. He approached the crate, sniffed it thoroughly, then hopped inside himself. Mataranka watched, confused. Boomer turned around inside the crate and made that soft clicking sound again. The message was clear. Safe. Come. Slowly. Painfully. Mataranka hopped to the crate entrance. He looked at Christopher, then at Sarah, then back at his brother. Then he hopped inside. Sarah quickly closed and secured the door. "We've got a problem," Christopher said. "Boomer's not going to let us take his brother without him." As if to prove the point, Boomer began frantically scratching at the crate door, making distress sounds. Jack looked at his truck bed. "We can fit another crate." They did. 20 minutes later, 2 massive red kangaroos were loaded into transport crates, secured in the back of Jack Reynolds' truck, ready for the 3-hour drive to the Outback Wildlife Sanctuary. Christopher rode in the back with them, monitoring their condition, making sure they stayed calm. Through the ventilation holes, he could see them watching each other, taking comfort from each other's presence. Brothers. The drive was long and rough. Twice they had to stop because Mataranka's wounds started bleeding through the sutures. Sarah, following in her own vehicle, redressed the wounds on the side of the road, while kangaroos and humans alike sweltered in the heat. But they made it. The Outback Wildlife Sanctuary was an oasis in the drought, solar-powered pumps bringing water from deep aquifers, creating green paddocks where rescued animals could recover. Sarah had built it over 15 years, starting with nothing but a dream and a veterinary degree. Now it housed everything from injured wallabies to orphaned dingoes to birds with broken wings. And today, 2 red kangaroo brothers who'd survived something that should have killed them both. Mataranka's recovery was slow. The infection fought back against antibiotics for 3 days before finally breaking. Twice, Sarah thought she'd lose him to septic shock. But each time he pulled through, Boomer never left his side. They kept the brothers in adjacent recovery pens, close enough to touch noses through the fence. Whenever Mataranka's condition worsened, Boomer would become agitated, thumping the ground in distress until Sarah let him into his brother's pen. Then he'd settle beside Mataranka, and somehow that seemed to help more than any medicine. Christopher visited every day, documenting the recovery, filming footage for a documentary he was already planning in his head. Jack Reynolds visited too, surprising everyone. The old salvager would bring fresh browse, native grasses and leaves, and stand at the fence, watching the roost with an expression Christopher couldn't quite read. Never knew they were that smart, Jack said one day. That loyal? Most people don't, Christopher replied. We shoot a lot of them. For the bounty, for the meat, 'cause they eat grass we need for cattle. Jack was quiet for a moment. Maybe we're shooting the wrong thing. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was something. After 2 weeks, Mataranka could walk without limping. After 3 weeks, he could hop short distances. After a month, Sarah declared him well enough to be released, with conditions. He'll never be 100%, she explained to Christopher. The muscle damage is permanent. He won't be able to defend territory against younger challengers. And Boomer, she paused, watching the younger Roo through the fence. Boomer left his mob for a month to stay here with his brother. That mob might not take him back. They might have a new leader now. Christopher understood what she wasn't saying. Releasing these two meant releasing them into an uncertain future, possibly as wanderers, possibly to starve alone. What if they don't have to go back to the old territory? He asked. Sarah raised an eyebrow. What are you thinking? What Christopher's thinking was ambitious and probably stupid, but then again, most of his best ideas started that way. The idea was simple. Create a new mob. The sanctuary had rescued 7 female kangaroos over the past year. Various injuries, all recovered, all ready for release. They also had 3 young males, not yet old enough to challenge for dominance. If Mataranka and Boomer could establish themselves as the leadership of this new group, they'd have a mob without having to fight for it. Sarah was skeptical. You can't just throw random roosts together and call them a mob. It doesn't work that way. Why not? Because mobs are built on relationships, hierarchies, trust. These animals don't know each other. Then we give them time to get acquainted before release. It was unorthodox. It probably violated several wildlife management protocols. But Sarah had built her career on unorthodox solutions, so she agreed to try. They set up a large enclosure, 5 acres of natural habitat, and slowly introduced the kangaroos to each other in controlled circumstances. Mataranka and Boomer were first, establishing the space as theirs. Then they brought in the females, one at a time, over several days. The doves were cautious at first, circling these 2 strange males, assessing threat levels. But Mataranka and Boomer showed no aggression. They shared water sources, shared feeding areas, made space. Slowly, over weeks, something remarkable happened. The doves began to accept them, not as strangers, but as leaders. It helped that Mataranka, even weakened, carried himself with quiet authority, and Boomer, with his scars and steady presence, projected strength without threat. The young males were introduced last. And here's where it got interesting. In a normal mob, young males were driven out when they reached maturity, forced to wander alone or form bachelor groups until they were strong enough to challenge for their own territory. But Boomer didn't drive them out. He mentored them. Christopher watched through telephoto lenses as Boomer taught the youngsters to spar properly, to establish hierarchy without causing serious injury. He showed them which plants were best for nutrition, which water sources were safest. He was building something new, a mob that welcomed young males instead of exiling them. He's creating a dynasty, Christopher murmured to Sarah one evening as they watched the mob interact. He's creating something, Sarah agreed. I'm just not sure what. After 2 months, the mob had gelled. They moved as a unit, grazed as a unit, slept in a protective circle with the Joeys at the center. Sarah ran final health checks on all of them. Mataranka had recovered as much as he was going to, still slower than a healthy male, still bearing scars that would last his lifetime, but functional. Strong enough to lead, if not to fight. The release was scheduled for dawn, 3 days from now. But before that could happen, everything went sideways in a way nobody had predicted. The drought broke. It didn't break gradually, with gentle rains and grateful earth. It broke violently, with storms that rolled in from the north carrying months of pent-up precipitation. The first drops hit at midnight. By dawn, it was a deluge. Flash floods roared down dry creek beds. The land, baked hard by months of drought, couldn't absorb the water fast enough. It pooled and flowed, then raged. The sanctuary's enclosures were well designed for normal rain. They weren't designed for this. Christopher was sleeping in his camper van in the sanctuary parking area when Sarah's panic call woke him at 3 a.m. The enclosures are flooding. We need to evacuate the animals. He threw on boots and rain gear and ran. The scene was chaos. Water poured through the sanctuary, turning paddocks into lakes. Several enclosures had already breached, and animals were scattered into the darkness. Wallabies, wombats, a confused echidna paddling frantically toward higher ground. The kangaroo enclosure was the worst. It sat in a natural depression that had seemed like good shelter. Now it was a bowl filling with water. Sarah and her 2 assistants were trying to open the gates, but the flooding had jammed the mechanisms. The water was already a meter deep inside and rising fast through the sheeting rain. Christopher could see the mob huddled on the highest point of the enclosure, a small rise that was shrinking by the minute. "We can't get the gates open." Sarah shouted over the storm. "The water pressure is too strong." Christopher looked at the fence. Standard wildlife fencing, tall, strong, designed to keep kangaroos in. We cut through. With what? The bolt cutters are in the shed, and the shed's under water. The mob was panicking now. Kangaroos can swim, but they're not built for it. In water this deep, they'd tire quickly. And there were joeys in that group, babies who couldn't swim at all. Christopher ran to his Land Cruiser and yanked open the back. He removed most of his camera equipment, but there, his emergency kit, including the portable angle grinder he used for bush maintenance. He grabbed it and ran back to the fence, praying the battery still had charge. Sarah saw what he was planning. "That's chain link. It'll take forever." "You have a better idea?" He didn't wait for an answer. He fired up the grinder and pressed it against the fence. Sparks flew, barely visible in the rain. The chain link was tough, designed to resist bolt cutters and determined animals. The grinder's blade was meant for cutting branches, not metal, but it was all they had. Behind him, he heard Sarah organizing her team, getting recovery equipment ready, preparing for whatever was about to happen. Inside the enclosure, Boomer was organizing too. He'd gathered the mob to the highest point and positioned himself at the edge, between them and the rising water. Mataranka stood beside him, despite his limitations, presenting a unified front. The does had formed a tight circle around the joeys, keeping them calm despite the storm. It was exactly what a good mob did in crisis. It was exactly what good leaders did. Christopher cut through the first section of fence. Then the second. The grinder's battery was dying. He could hear the motor straining. Come on. Come on. Third section. Fourth. The battery died. He'd cut a gap maybe 2 meters wide, big enough for kangaroos to get through, but the fence was still standing, still held taut by the posts. "Sarah, I need help pulling this section down." She and her assistants grabbed the cut section. Christopher grabbed it too. They pulled. The fence was designed to withstand a lot of force. It didn't want to come down. Inside the enclosure, the water had reached the mob's position. The smallest joey was already swimming, terrified, making sound that cut through the storm. "Pull!" Sarah screamed. They pulled together, feet slipping in mud, rain blinding them. The fence gave way with a screech of tortured metal. The gap was clear. Boomer! Christopher shouted, knowing it was stupid, knowing Roo couldn't understand words, but hoping tone and gesture would communicate. He gestured frantically toward the opening. Boomer saw it, but he didn't move. He was watching the water, calculating something. Then Christopher understood. If the mob moved to the gap, they have to swim through deeper water. The Joeys wouldn't make it, but if they stayed, they'd all drown. Boomer made his choice. He plunged into the water and swam, not toward the gap, but toward the nearest Joey. He grabbed the baby kangaroo gently in his arms and began swimming back toward the gap. Mataranka saw what his brother was doing, and dove in too, swimming toward another struggling Joey. The Duz understood. They began swimming too, each grabbing a Joey, working together to ferry the babies to safety. Christopher and Sarah's team positioned themselves at the gap, ready to help any animal that made it through. One by one, the mob evacuated. Boomer made 3 trips, saving 3 Joeys. Mataranka made 2, pushing his damaged body to its limits. The Duz saved the rest. Finally, only the 2 brothers remained in the flooding enclosure. They swam toward the gap together, side by side. Mataranka was exhausted. His old wounds had reopened from the exertion. Blood streamed from his legs, mixing with the floodwater. Halfway to the gap, he started to sink. Boomer turned back immediately. He grabbed his brother and supported him, keeping his head above water. But Boomer was exhausted too. The current was strong. They were both going under. Christopher didn't think. He waded into the water, felt the current grab at him, fought it. He reached the 2 roosts and grabbed Mataranka's shoulders. "Sarah, help!" Sarah plunged in, grabbed Boomer. Together, humans and kangaroos fought their way to the gap. They made it through, collapsed on the muddy ground outside the fence, all of them breathing hard, all of them alive. The storm raged around them, but the mob was safe. All 13 kangaroos huddled together on a small rise, drenched and exhausted but together. Christopher lay in the mud, too tired to move, watching them. Boomer was grooming Mataranka's fur, checking his brother for injuries. The Duz were checking their Joeys. The young males were standing guard, watching for threats. They were a mob, a real mob, built not from territory or bloodlines, but from shared survival. Sarah collapsed beside Christopher. That was insane. "Yeah, we could have died. Yeah, don't ever do anything like that again." Christopher managed a tired laugh. "Deal." The rain continued through the night, but by morning it had gentled to a steady drizzle. The sanctuary was a disaster area. Fences down, enclosures flooded, equipment ruined. It would take weeks to rebuild, but the animals were safe. All of them. And the land, for the first time in 18 months, was drinking deep. The flood changed everything. The drought had broken across the entire region. Within days, the brown landscape began transforming to green. Grass sprouted. Wildflowers bloomed. Creeks that had been dry for a year began flowing again. The herds returned. Cattle, wild horses, and crucially, the wild kangaroo mobs that had migrated north, including Mataranka's original mob. Christopher spotted them 3 weeks after the flood, filming wildlife recovery footage about 15 kilometers from the sanctuary. He recognized the lead doe immediately, Skip's mother, distinctive because of a scar across her shoulder. And there, among the mob, was Skip himself. No longer a Joey, but an adolescent male, nearly adult-sized. The mob looked healthy, well-fed, thriving under Boomer's absence. But they also looked different. The new dominant male, a young buck Christopher didn't recognize, was aggressive in a way Mataranka had never been. Christopher watched him charge at the younger males, driving them away from food, asserting dominance through force rather than earned respect. Skip hung at the edges of the mob, looking uncertain. Christopher tracked this mob for 3 days, documenting their patterns. He noticed something troubling. The new leader was making bad decisions. He'd established territory that included a dried-up waterhole and excluded a reliable creek. He drove away younger males who could have helped defend against dingoes. He was burning through the mob's goodwill in a way that would eventually break them apart. The mob was surviving, but they weren't thriving. Meanwhile, back at the sanctuary, Mataranka and Boomer's newly formed mob was adapting to their temporary home beautifully. The enclosures were being rebuilt, but Sarah was letting the mob free range in a supervised area during the day. They developed their own patterns, their own hierarchy. Mataranka led through calm authority. Boomer handled the physical challenges. The does had sorted themselves into a cooperative structure, and the young males, instead of being driven away, were being taught. "This is unprecedented," Sarah told Christopher one evening as they watched the mob interact. "I've never seen anything like this social structure." "It's what they should have been all along," Christopher replied. "We just never gave them the chance." The release date was approaching. The mob was healthy, cohesive, ready for the wild. But Christopher had been thinking, what if they went back to Mataranka's old territory? He asked Sarah. She frowned. "There's already a mob there. We saw them. A mob that's being poorly led. A mob that includes Mataranka's son." "You're suggesting what exactly?" "That Mataranka challenges the new leader and takes back his territory. Mataranka can't fight, but maybe he doesn't need to." Sarah studied him. "You're planning something." "I'm considering options." "Christopher, just trust me." The next morning, Christopher drove out to where he'd last seen the original mob. He set up cameras at multiple angles, then did something that probably violated every wildlife protocol in existence. He played a recording. It was a sound he'd captured weeks ago, Mataranka's distinctive call. Every kangaroo had a slightly different vocalization, like a fingerprint made a sound. The recording echoed across the plains. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Skip's head came up. His ears swiveled toward the sound. He knew that call. He knew his father. Skip began hopping toward the source, moving faster and faster. The rest of the mob watched him go, confused. When Skip crested the rise and saw Christopher instead of his father, the young roo stopped, visibly confused. Christopher played the recording again. Skip approached cautiously. He circled Christopher's vehicle, sniffing, searching. Then Christopher did something even more questionable. He brought items from the sanctuary, blankets that carried Mataranka's scent, medical supplies that had touched his fur. He laid them out on the ground. Skip sniffed them thoroughly. Recognition flooded his body language. Ears up, tail relaxed, soft clicking sounds of happiness. His father was alive. His father was somewhere. Christopher played the recording one more time, then slowly drove away, back toward the sanctuary. Skip followed. It took 3 hours. Christopher drove slowly, stopping frequently to make sure Skip was still following. The young roo stayed about 50 meters back, cautious but committed. When they reached the sanctuary, Christopher led Skip to the area where the new mob was free-ranging, and Skip saw his father. Mataranka was grazing with Boomer, the two brothers side by side as always. At the sound of the approaching vehicle, both their heads came up. Then Mataranka saw Skip. The reunion was everything Christopher had hoped to capture on film, and more. Skip bounded forward, making sounds Christopher had never heard a kangaroo make. Joy mixed with relief mixed with apology. Mataranka met him halfway, and they touched noses, then groomed each other's fur, making soft clicking sounds. Boomer watched from a short distance, giving them space but clearly pleased. Skip met the new mob, his father's new family. The does accepted him immediately. The young males sized him up, established where he fit in the hierarchy. It was peaceful and natural. Skip had found his father, and in doing so, he'd found something else, a mob built on different principles than the one he'd left. That night, Sarah confronted Christopher. You manipulated that young Rue into following you. I gave him information. He made his own choices. That's a very fine line. All the important ones are... Sarah was quiet for a moment. The original mob will come looking for him. I know. And when they do, we'll see what happens. 3 days later, it happened. The original mob appeared on the ridge above the sanctuary at dawn. 12 kangaroos, led by the aggressive young buck who'd taken Mataranka's place. Skip's mother was with them. She'd tracked her son's scent. The new mob, Mataranka's mob, was grazing in the valley below. Mataranka saw the arrivals immediately and went still. Christopher, filming from his vehicle, held his breath. This was it, the moment that would determine everything. The young buck descended the ridge, moving with aggressive confidence. He'd never seen Mataranka before, didn't know the old leader had survived. He just saw an unknown mob on what he considered his expanded territory. He approached with clear hostile intent. Mataranka stood his ground. Beside him, Boomer tensed, ready to defend his brother. But Mataranka made a soft sound, a signal Boomer understood. Stay back. Let me handle this. The young buck closed the 30 meters and issued a challenge. The traditional kangaroo fighting stance, balance on tail, arms spread. Mataranka didn't mirror the stance. He just stood there, calm and steady. The buck, confused by this non-response, moved closer. 20 meters. 10. Then Skip stepped between them. The young male, his body language screaming, "This is my father. You will not challenge him." The buck was taken aback. Skip was smaller, younger, not ready to challenge for leadership, but he was ready to fight for his father. The standoff lasted forever and no time at all. Then something remarkable happened. 2 of the doves from the original mob, including Skip's mother, descended the ridge and positioned themselves beside Mataranka. They'd made their choice. Then one of the young males from the original mob joined them. Then another. Within minutes, half the original mob had defected. The aggressive young buck found himself standing alone with only 4 followers. Not enough to maintain a viable mob. He'd lost, not through combat, but through respect. Or rather, the lack of it. Mataranka hadn't fought. He just stood there, calm and confident, and let others make their own choices about who they wanted to follow. The young buck, realized he'd been outmaneuvered in a way he didn't fully understand, backed off. He and his remaining followers disappeared over the ridge. They'd survive, might even thrive if the buck learned from this. But they were no longer the dominant mob in this territory. Mataranka was, and his mob, now numbering over 20 kangaroos, was a mix of old and new, built on principles of cooperation rather than domination. Sarah stood beside Christopher, watching the impossible scene unfold. Did we just witness a bloodless revolution? I think we did. This is going to completely rewrite how we understand kangaroo social structures. Good, Christopher said. Maybe we've been getting it wrong all along. 6 months later, Christopher returned to the territory for a final documentary shoot. The land had transformed. The drought was a memory, replaced by green grass and flowing creeks. Wildlife was thriving. The ecosystem had rebounded with remarkable resilience. Mataranka's mob had settled into a territory that included both the old cattle station and the green valley near the sanctuary. It was prime land, and they defended it not through aggression, but through sheer numbers and coordinated defense. The mob had grown to 30 individuals. Doves from neighboring groups had joined, attracted by the stability and the unusual structure that welcomed rather than exiled young males. Christopher found them near a waterhole at sunset, the golden light painting everything in warm tones. Mataranka stood on a small rise, surveying his territory. He moved differently now, slower, more careful of his old injuries. but he carried himself with quiet dignity. Beside him, as always, stood Boomer. The younger brother had earned his own respect within the mob, but he'd never challenged Mataranka's leadership. He didn't need to. They ruled together, each complementing the other's strengths. Skip was there too, now nearly adult-sized, showing younger males how to spar properly. He'd learned from Boomer's example and was passing it on. And there, in the center of the mob, protected by a circle of does, a tiny Joey, Mataranka's newest offspring, born just weeks ago. The circle of life continuing. Christopher filmed for an hour, capturing the peaceful scene. This would be the closing sequence of his documentary. The story of two brothers, loyalty stronger than survival instinct, and a mob built on principles of cooperation. He was packing up his equipment when something unexpected happened. A vehicle appeared on the horizon, Jack Reynolds' old pickup truck. Christopher watched as Jack parked and walked to the fence line, staying respectful distance from the mob. The old salvager stood there for several minutes, just watching the kangaroos. Then he pulled something from his truck bed, bundles of fresh native grasses, the kind that kangaroos loved. He laid them out near the fence, careful not to disturb a mob. When he noticed Christopher watching, he shrugged, figured they earned it. After everything, you're feeding them now? Sometimes, when I'm out this way. Jack was quiet for a moment. Billy and we got that bounty contract canceled. Told the regional council we'd do the population monitoring instead. Make sure numbers stay balanced without culling. That's unexpected. Been doing a lot of thinking since that day. About what matters. About what we're leaving behind. Jack looked at the mob. These animals, they're not just pests. They're part of something bigger than us. Took you long enough to figure that out, Christopher said, but without heat. Jack smiled. Some of us are slow learners. He climbed back in his truck and drove away, leaving the grass bundles behind. The mob approached cautiously after he left, sniffed the grass, and began eating. Mataranka watched from his rise, then looked directly at Christopher's camera. For just a moment, it felt like the old Roo was acknowledging what had happened between them, acknowledging the choice Christopher had made to help instead of ignore, acknowledging the chain of events that had saved not just one life, but rebuilt an entire family. Then Mataranka returned his attention to his mob, and the moment passed. Christopher packed up and prepared to leave. His documentary was complete. The story had its ending. But as he drove away, he realized something. This wasn't an ending at all. It was a beginning. The mob would continue to grow, to thrive, to challenge assumptions about what kangaroo social structures could be. Other mobs might observe and learn. The principles of cooperation over domination might spread, or they might not. Nature didn't work on human timelines or human assumptions. But either way, Mataranka and Boomer had proven something important. That loyalty matters. That family, however you define it, matters. That survival isn't just about the strongest or the fastest, but about those who stand together. Christopher's documentary, Brothers of the Red Earth, would premiere 6 months later. It would win awards, change policies, and inspire a new generation of wildlife conservationists. But more importantly, it would change how people saw kangaroos. Not as pests or resources, but as complex, intelligent, emotional beings worthy of respect. And in the Australian Outback, in a territory that included an old cattle station and a green valley near a wildlife sanctuary, a mob of 30 kangaroos would graze and rest and raise their young, led by 2 brothers who refused to let wire, drought, or death separate them, who chose loyalty over survival, and in doing so, survived anyway.
If the story moved you, if it changed how you see the animals we share this planet with, then please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to see what loyalty, sacrifice, and family truly look like. Leave a comment telling me about a time you witnessed animals showing intelligence, emotion, or bonds that surprised you. I'll read every single one and your stories. Fuel the next rescue, the next documentary, the next chance to make a difference. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And remember, sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to leave someone behind. See you in the next story.